Shocking! The horrible truth about punishment in the Middle Ages. Have you ever wondered how people in the Middle Ages reacted to the extreme brutality of punishment during that time period? Have you ever considered how the medieval period's punishment system was influenced by social status and gender? Did you know that the wealthy nobility often received more lenient punishment compared to the poor of the same crimes, or that women were subjected to harsher punishments than men? From public executions to cruel and unusual torture methods, the medieval period was a time of extreme brutality when it came to punishing criminals. So, if you think you can handle the truth, stick around, because we're about to uncover the shocking and horrible truth about punishment in the Middle Ages. Violence was a big problem in the Middle Ages. People would get into drunken fights, commit rape, and even kill each other in large numbers. It was a pretty dark time in history, but believe it or not, our medieval ancestors were just as disgusted by these violent acts as we are today. In medieval times, castles had a special prison called a dungeon. This is where people who committed serious crimes like treason, which meant betraying the king, were locked up. But there were other terrible punishments for criminals and traitors too. Many of these punishments were done in public to scare others from committing crimes. Punishments in the medieval period varied depending on social status. The wealthy nobility often received more lenient punishments compared to the poor. For example, the nobility could pay a fine to avoid punishment, or receive a less severe punishment than the poor for the same crime. In contrast, the poor were often subjected to brutal punishments for even minor offenses. They could be publicly whipped, put in the stocks, or have their ears cut off for theft. For more severe crimes, such as treason or murder, the punishment was often death by hanging, beheading, or burning at the stake. Gender also played a role in the severity of punishments. Women were often subjected to harsher punishments than men for the same crimes. For example, women accused of adultery could be drowned, while men would typically only face a fine. The punishment system during the medieval period was harsh and often disproportionate to the crime committed. It was also influenced by social status and gender, with the wealthy and men often receiving more lenient punishments than the poor and women. The court system in the Middle Ages was heavily influenced by the beliefs and values of the time. Punishments were often harsh and brutal because they were seen as a means of both punishing the offender and deterring others from committing similar crimes. There was a belief in the concept of an eye for an eye, where the punishment should fit the crime. Truth about beheadings. Beheading was viewed as a more humane way of execution in medieval England than other gruesome forms such as being hanged, drawn, and quartered. Although early beheadings involved an axe and were painful, later efficient swords were used for a relatively speedy death. Beheading continued to be used for centuries, including by King Henry VIII, but was outlawed in England in 1790. The last recorded beheading in Europe was in South Africa in 1868. Death by elephant. Death by elephant was one of the most brutal execution methods during the medieval era. For thousands of years, people have trained elephants to do all sorts of things, from helping armies to building temples. But did you know that elephants were also used for medieval executions? This method was called death by the elephant and involved using the strength of the elephant to crush the victim, usually by stepping on their head or abdomen. Sometimes, the elephant was trained to torture the victims before killing them. This was often done in public as a way for rulers to show their power. Death by elephants was mainly used in Southeast Asia and continued until the late 19th century. Crushing with weights. Crushing was an execution method used in England starting in the 13th century, where weight was slowly added to a person to force them to plead guilty or not guilty to a crime. This often led to the victim's death and continued until the Enlightenment era. Famous victims of crushing include Margaret Clitheroe and Giles Corey. England outlawed the practice in 1772. Death by gibbet. Have you heard of gibbeting? It was a medieval practice where criminals were locked in human-shaped cages and hung in public areas as a warning to others. The bodies were left hanging for years, and the smell was terrible. Interestingly, women were spared from gibbeting because their bodies were wanted by doctors for scientific study. This practice finally became illegal in 1834, after 134 men were subjected to it. The Viking Blood Eagle. During the Viking Age, Norse warriors used a gruesome execution method called the Blood Eagle for revenge and ritual torture. Only 2 written accounts of the practice exist, both written at least 2 centuries after the first ceremony. Scholars still debate whether Vikings actually performed the blood eagle, which involved tying the victim's hands and legs, stabbing them in the tailbone, separating each rib from the backbone with an axe, and pulling out the lungs to form 2 bloody wings. The blood eagle was used to honor Odin and punish dishonorable individuals, but its validity is still questioned by some scholars despite evidence from Old Norse term bluorn and illustrations on the Storhammar stones in Gotland, Sweden. Death by boiling. Boiling someone to death was one of the most painful ways to die in the Middle Ages. Long ago, the Roman Emperor Nero killed thousands of Christians with this method, but it became even more popular in the Holy Roman Empire to punish people who made fake coins. They would be placed in a container filled with a boiling liquid like water, oil, wax, or even molten lead. It was absolutely horrible. The person's limbs and organs would cook slowly until they died. It was even worse if the liquid was not yet boiling when they were put in. King Henry VIII in Britain used this method as a punishment for people who used poison to commit murder. It was a slow and torturous death, and it was terrible that people had to go through it. It was used as a go-to method of punishment for forgers, but eventually they figured out how to make it easier to tell if a coin was fake, and the practice of boiling to death slowly started to come to an end. Death by impalement. In the Middle Ages, Vlad the Impaler ruled Wallachia and impaled his enemies as a gruesome punishment. He partially sharpened a stake, planted it in the ground, and skewered the victim through the rectum or vagina. The victim suffered a prolonged death that could last for hours or days. Vlad impaled dozens of Saxon merchants and put around 20,000 people on display, terrifying anyone who saw it. Impalement was meant to be a warning and continued until recently as the 20th century during the Armenian Genocide, burning at the stake. During the Middle Ages, the punishment was brutal and excessive. Women accused of witchcraft or heresy often faced burning at the stake, a painful and agonizing form of execution. Accusations were often baseless, arising from petty rivalries and jealousy. The victim would be bound to a stake, surrounded by kindling, and set on fire, enduring excruciating pain until death mercifully took them. Some were given a container of gunpowder to shorten the agony. Despite being barbaric, burning at the stake was a popular punishment for various crimes and continued well into the 18th century. These executions were meant to deter others, but only showed the dark side of human cruelty. These punishments were not only physically brutal, but also intended to be emotionally terrifying for both the offender and the public. The Middle Ages are considered one of the harshest periods in European history, with cruel and terrible punishment methods. It's important to note that while these practices may seem barbaric by modern standards, they were considered acceptable at the time and were often carried out publicly to deter others from breaking the law. It is reassuring that most of the world has moved away from the brutal methods of execution used in the Middle Ages. However, it remains to be seen whether future generations will also abandon the supposed more civilized methods of execution that are still being employed today. So guys, if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. And if you have any suggestions for future topics, please let us know in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious and keep learning.